All right, well, thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to participate in this event. And thank you, everyone out there. I can't see everyone, I can see a few. I have to say up front, I'm really glad I can see some people because I do some of these Zoom talks and you don't have the little, box there where you can see folk. And invariably, in the middle of one, I have a attack of panic. I have a panic attack because I think there's no one out there and I'm just talking into the void. And in some way, we are all talking into the void, but this is like it's very, very strange. It's a strange experience. So I'm glad you're there. And what I'm going to talk about is it's based on a book of mine called The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. That came out around 2017. And just in advance, I have to say there's going to be quite a lot of white males in this talk, dead ones, dead white European males. And I don't know if the dwem is, if that's still a phrase. I remember when I was back in university as a mature student in the late 80s and early 90s. Yeah, the dead white European males. That's a good name for a band. But they were like they were the target for everybody. The deconstructionists, the feminists, post-colonialists, postmodernists, the Frankfurt School of Critical Thinking, and all that. And I kind of like them. So it's good. There's one living white European male in here. With any luck, we'll get to him. And this is one dead white European woman. And this is Kathleen Raine. And the reason she's here is she coined the phrase lost knowledge of the imagination. And Kathleen Raine was a poet, but also a Blake scholar, scholar also of W.B. Yeats and Coleridge and the English romantic poetry in general, which she believed had inherited a lost tradition in European culture, in culture in the West, the Platonic or the Neoplatonic tradition. And we'll get around to how that sort of happened. But Kathleen Raine, remarkable woman. She didn't come into her own until around her 60s. So not only a woman, making a mark for herself in the academic world, going against the tide or the current of the academic world at the time is more materialism, secularism, modern poetry, pretty much truncated sentences, and having to do with everyday life, the kitchen sink, or if you know T.S. Eliot and Prufrock and this sort of thing. And she came into her own in the 1960s, an immense study of the visionary poet William Blake. And I assume you know Blake, but it's from him the term doors of perception comes from, that Aldous Huxley used for his little book about his experience at Mescaline that he published in the early 1950s. And it's also from him that the rock band in the 60s, The Doors, got their name from. And Blake was a visionary poet, a visionary in the sense that he actually had visions of these mythological figures that he wrote these immense poems about. But Kathleen Raine also was the heart and soul and the motive force behind what was known as the Temenos Society. It's still active here in London. Temenos is a Greek word for the space before the temple, the sacred space in front of the temple. And this was a society where she tried to carry on what she would call the learning of the imagination, to carry on this tradition through talks and publications and things of that sort. So that's the background to the book. And we talk about imagination. We tend to think, it's one of those things we think we know what it is. In one sense, we do intuitively. But I think once we start asking questions about it, it's like time. St. Augustine famously said, when he was asked what is time, he said, if you don't ask me the question, I know the answer. But once he tried to answer the question in some explicit, literal way, everything became loose and he couldn't do it. So imagination, I think, is one of these things. It ties in with memory, self-consciousness, other modes of our consciousness, our awareness. So I think if we try to get a very, very explicit definition of it, it would make it even more obscure. But we do have a general sense that it has to do with make-believe. you know, non-reality, having to do with fantasy, magic in the kind of popular kind of sense. And when I was growing up, and you know, Wonderful World of Disney, which is, you know, a huge world now, but then it was a television show on Sunday nights. But you know, it's all about magic, make believe, or you have the kind of utilitarian um, appropriation or use of magic on the cutting edge. You know, you're ahead of your competitors with new ideas in technology and a variety of other ways and things of that sort. And there's also, you know, it's an activity that we kind of participate in when we turn off the critical mind and just looking out the window, you know, on a train journey. So you daydream in a certain sense. And of course, imagination has a home in the arts. So we have Beethoven here at music, we've got Picasso painting, Michelangelo's David, and this is Vaslav Nijinsky, the incredible ballet dancer in the early 20th century, who it was believed was able to defy gravity. It was thought that when he did his leaps, he was able to be stationary in the air, you know, a foot or two above the stage. So that was, whether that's true or not, but that's what he was known for. So we have the imagination, you know, in this kind of way, and we accept it. It's part of life. It's something that, you know, we would miss it if we didn't have it, even though many people don't have much imagination. And I think looking at a lot of contemporary culture, there's not particularly a heck of a lot of it on tap at the moment as well. But you know, we sort of find a place for it. But it's something that's extra. It's kind of on the side. And I said in the early one, it's talking about make believe, but I actually think imagination is about make real. And if you meditate and contemplate what we mean when we say we realize something, generally it's something you know already. Oh, I knew that, but I didn't realize it. But think about, what does that mean? I didn't realize it. You had made something that you knew factually into a reality. It didn't appear in front of you. You didn't realize it, like, you know, hocus pocus, but you actually, you turned something that was just, you knew factually, as just kind of a flat two-dimensional. The only way we can talk about these things is metaphorically. So it's like flat two-dimensional. Oh yeah, yes. But then, oh no, I realized that you made it, you brought it into being. And one of the signs of that is actually has an effect on you. When you realize something, you act in a certain way based on that. So that's just a sort of background to how I see imagination. It's not necessarily about fantasy, even though it's involved in that, and make believe and getting away from reality. I think it's actually a way that we can engage with reality on a deeper and more existential, in the sense that, you know, it's a felt effect of our engagement is part of it. But do we ever think of imagination as a way of knowledge, as a way of knowing things? Well, this is what Kathleen Raine investigated for many years in her writings about Blake and the other poets, and in tracing the remnants of what we would call a tradition of rejected knowledge. This is a phrase coming from the early historian of the occult, James Webb, who wrote in the 1970s. And he coined the phrase rejected knowledge. Rejected knowledge is this body of knowledge that was rejected at a certain time on history. And it includes sort of the Hermetic tradition, or this Neoplatonic tradition, or the tradition of Gnosticism, what we would call the esoteric kind of traditions, but also, you know, parapsychology and psychic phenomenon and a variety of other things like that. All of that was rejected at one point, and continues to be rejected by the dominant mode of knowing that we'll get onto. And when I say imagination is the way of knowledge, I don't mean knowledge about the imagination. There's lots of that. If you go online, if you Google imagination, or as I do, and I do my research, I go to the British Library here in London, which advertises itself as home of the world's knowledge, which is actually a misnomer, because it's home of the world's information. Knowledge exists here. and in yours. Knowledge does not exist in the books and in the papers and all that sort of stuff. That's the information. That's the material that we can know. We can absorb this material, this stuff called information. Then it becomes knowledge. With any luck, and this happens less and less these days, if you work at it, we can arrive at wisdom, which is knowing what to do with the knowledge, which is always a tough one these days, and always has been, because having knowledge, as Francis Bacon said ages ago, knowledge is power, and it is a particular kind of power, and that's associated with a way of knowing that we're going to get onto. Imagination as a way of knowledge. Just think about, it has a noetic character to it. Noetic means has some knowledgeable content, some information, some aspect, some dimension of reality is revealed to you, made available to you through imagination. So once again, it's rather than making up lots of things, interesting, fun, novelty kinds of things. No, it's actually using this faculty we're calling imagination. As I said earlier, it bleeds into everything else about our consciousness too. So it's not like, okay, yeah, that part of my mind over there, that's imagination. This is a way we talk about it in that way in order to understand it and to get a handle on it. But they all kind of blend in together. But in some way, this faculty that we call imagination gives us knowledge of the world outside in the same way that what we usually think of as knowledge, the intellect, the reason. The ancient Greeks, they had two different words for knowledge. We don't, we have one. They have two different words for knowledge. There was episteme, which means knowledge you get from empirical, the senses, or study, or reading, or from logic and reason, which the kind of logic that, we're taught in schools. But then there was gnosis, which is a kind of a smack immediate, unmediated, direct knowing of things. And it's as direct as, when it's a very hot day and you take a, cool drink and you don't think, oh, let me see, has that quenched my thirst? And I add up different factors and oh yes, it all figures out that, yes, no, you just smacks you in the face and you're not thirsty anymore. It's that kind of knowing. And there were the early Christians in the very early Christian period were known as the Gnostics because they pursued this experience, this kind of esoteric knowledge or experiential knowledge. That's what we can say. So gnosis is a kind of experiential knowledge. It's not only knowledge that you get in some way. Here's some knowledge. You experience what you're getting. Okay, so, but there was a time when imagination, even though it wasn't spoken of in this way, because we don't talk about imagination in this kind of explicit way until later on historically. Earlier, but it was. We look back now and we can see that it's the case, but the people living at that time, they didn't go around saying, oh, I'm using my imagination now to do this X, Y, and Z. They lived in it. It was the entire world for them at the time. This was the mythological age. I mean, we mentioned Jean Gebser's name came up as one of the people talking about evolution. Although he doesn't use the word evolution, he uses the word mutation. He doesn't like the word evolution because it's associated with Darwinian and actually notions of progress. So for him, mutations of consciousness aren't necessarily aligned or identical with this idea of progress, a kind of linear kind of progress. That idea itself, a linear kind of progress, is a product of a particular structure of consciousness that we're in at the moment, what he called the mental rational structure of consciousness. But he also believed that it was in the process of dissolving, deconstructing itself, breaking down. He died in the early 70s, 1973, but he did believe that we were experiencing the beginning of the breakdown of the mental rational consciousness structure. And had he lived longer, I think he would have seen quite a bit of evidence for corroboration of his belief. But to get an idea, that was where we are now, but how did we get here? Well, we have to go back in history a bit. Let me just get a drink of water. Hold on a sec. Okay, and we're going to go back to a period that the Existenzphilosophia Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age. And this is a period, 500 BC is kind of smack in the middle, so a century either side. And here's kind of a map laying out what happened in the Axial Age and why it's called that. Axial in the sense of axioms, kind of formulas or sayings or edicts to live by, or like the axle, it's that which around everything else kind of turns. And what Jaspers saw was that around this period, we've got 800, 400, so it's a big, it's a time. There was a sudden flowering in different parts of the known world of basically the views of the world that we still inhabit today and still guide us in some ways, if we're lucky. So in China, at the same time, you had Lao Tzu and Confucius, Taoism and Confucianism. In India, you had the writing of the Upanishads and the Buddha appearing. In Persia, you had the rise of Zoroastrianism, Zarathustra, Zoroaster, and this notion that the world is the field of battle of two cosmic forces, good and evil. I tend to think it's stupidity and intelligence, the way I look at it. And thinking about that is in the great cosmic battle between stupidity and intelligence, intelligence is at a disadvantage because it has only one weapon, truth. And stupidity can do whatever it wants. It can do anything it wants. There's no rules for stupidity. You can do anything it wants. So truth is always having a hard time. And you're right, life is not for the faint-hearted. It's a tough road to hoe here, but somebody's got to do it. So, but what happened in, I was going to say, in the Holy Land, you have the rise of the Hebrew patriarchs, and and the rise of Judaism there. So you had this flowering sort of religious, spiritual sensibility. And, today there are millions of Buddhists, there are people that study Taoism, there's Confucianism, we know these things are still living around us these days. But something happened in Greece as well. But it was different than what was happening in these other places. And over here in Greece, or Asia Minor, which was Turkey now, but it was called Asia Minor then. You had a flowering kind of, a kind of uprush of spiritual energy, rising up and starting to express itself. But it wasn't in a religious sense. It was the beginning of what the German philosopher Edmund Husserl called a theoretical man. It was the beginning of, it was the switch from the mythological age of the gods to rational inquiry. And this fellow here, Thales, he's considered the first philosopher in the way we understand the term philosopher these days, although the term wasn't around yet. That happened a bit later on. We'll get on to Pythagoras, the fellow who coined that phrase. But the thing, what makes Thales important is that it's not so much that he didn't accept, but he asked a different kind of question. So if you asked any kind of question about the world, you would get a story. Why does the sun come up every morning? Oh, well, that's Helios on his chariot, and whatever it is. There's some mythological narrative, some mythopoetic story would be the answer to your question, right? But he said, well, yeah, that's fine, that's okay, but I'm really interested in what's this made out of? And he points to a rock or something like that, or a cloud or something like, what's the stuff? What's the stuff that everything else is made out of? No, I don't want to know why the gods did that. That's perfectly fine. That's a good story. That's okay. I just want to know what that stuff is. So this is the beginning of rational inquiry. This is the beginning of asking questions. This is the beginning of curiosity. This is the beginning of being interested in something for its own enigmatic sake, not for utilitarian purposes. He didn't want to know what it was in order to use it in some way. So this is this strange, odd thing that comes out of what we later was called Europe, is this curiosity about what's that made out of? What makes it tick? That's an anachronism that it'd be ticking several centuries later on. But the whole idea of what makes it tick. So you get from sort of the mythopoetic, the mythical singer of stories and narratives, an imaginative way of at least explaining the world, right? We would think, well, they didn't really know it. They made, oh God, there's some thunder, so the gods are whatever doing something up there. But it's a way of knowing the world in terms of this kind of poetic story in an imaginative sort of way. And it's the shift from that to the thinker, who I think is my screen is blocked by all of you, and I'm so glad I can see you so I can keep talking. But there's the thinker, that's the Rodin statue. So it's thinking like, okay, what's it made out of? So Thales thought it was water, and there's a fellow Anaximenes it was air, and Heraclitus, who's known as the dark philosopher because he had these very gnomic sayings. I mean, we only have a few sheets of something that's Heraclitus, and we said nothing would delight us like a page of Heraclitus, because we don't have a page of Heraclitus. We have like a few one-liners. These gnomic kind of aphorisms, sorts of things. He was known as the dark philosopher, but he thought it was all fire, and other people thought it was all something. So there was one kind of thing that through different transmutations became everything else. But this is the beginning of rational inquiry. And it's the shift away from a mythological way of understanding things, an imaginative way, to a rational sort of way. But I mentioned Pythagoras. He actually coined the term philosopher, which means lover of wisdom. He also coined many terms that we still use: cosmos, theory, which actually comes from a Greek word theoros, which means to see. So when you speculate about something, my speculations, these are my specs, but I have speculations about things. But the two ways of seeing sorts of things. And I think Pythagoras was that he had one foot in each of the traditions. He was very keen on this new way of knowing things through rational inquiry, and he became obsessed with numbers. And he's the first one to argue that number is behind everything. So where the other ones are looking for some kind of stuff, some kind of matter, which again, matter is a concept. We never see matter. We see things that we say are made of matter, but you never see matter. You see something's made of wood, something's made of iron, something's water, it's gas. You never just show me some matter that's not like any of that. You'd never see it. Matter is a concept. So materialism is a kind of concept about what the world is like. So it's an idea, really, even though it's funny, it's an idea, but they say it's materialism. But in any case, but Pythagoras, he's the one who first one to say there's numbers behind everything. But it wasn't number in the way that we understand number, and we'll get on to that. It was number in its kind of essence. So there is a oneness, so qualitative character to numbers, and there's like two-ness or three-ness or something like that. And he developed this figure. And again, when we say I'll figure it out, and you write out, some mathematics, that was actually in the sand back then. They made figures in the sand when they were working out different geometric, arithmetical ideas. This is something called the tetrachus, and it's basically 10. And it's a way in which from the one, we get the all. I won't go through all the steps, but there was a way in which from one, there's two, and then they necessitate each one till you finally get to 9, and then it's the whole, and it's 10 and all that. So he was totally into number in that sense, and totally into trying to understand the universe in terms of number, in terms of these qualities. And we know we struggled, at least I did in school, to grasp the Pythagorean theorem. So he knew his geometry, and then Pythagoras is also the one, we say, discovered the octave, the Western octave in music. So the story is that he was walking past the smithy, and he noticed that when he was hammering the anvil, a certain size, it made a certain note, and then another and another. And so he figured out the octave, the relation of the length of a string to the sound. So, pretty spot on mathematics. You had to have a rational mind to think about or figure it all out. But at the same time, he believed that, not so much in the gods, but in the sense that it wasn't just matter. It wasn't just some kind of physical stuff at work in the world. There was some higher ideal. And the Pythagorean Brotherhood, they were the first sort of esoteric school in the West, because he certainly, saw philosophy as a method of rational inquiry, but he also saw it as a kind of mystical path. And it was a way in which the philosopher, through following the sort of rigors of that he would lay out for his students, they would come to hear the harmony of the spheres. And this is this notion that, as they believed, the Earth was the center, and then the planets moved around the Earth, and as the planets moved, they made a kind of sound. They made a certain harmony, and the philosopher could hear that. And Pythagoras himself, he came out of the earlier Dionysian and Orphic schools, which were completely in the mythic tradition. The Dionysian, transgressive revels, where people would get out of it, or basically get out of their conscious mind, like a good rave, out of their conscious mind, and feel this connection to the all and to themselves, and have a transformative, transpersonal experience that way. The Orphics went the other way. They were ascetics, through certain ascetic practices. They would quiet the body, and this would also lead to this participation in the all. But Pythagoras, he thought, no, there's a way we can do that without having to go, to the Dionysian excesses or to the austerities of the Orphic school. If we can learn how to hear the harmony of the spheres, if we can practice this philosophical pursuit. And so he's got, a foot in both camps. Plato, a century or so later on, he too has his foot in both camps. I mean, we know Socrates is the archetypal figure of the rational philosopher who's always asking questions. I mean, I taught philosophy for a while, many years ago, and there's a very early Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro. And Socrates, you really see him as the gadfly in it. You really see him as his pain in the ass, because he wants to understand the nature of piety. And so someone says, well, you should go talk to this fellow Euthyphro, because he knows all about piety. He's some kind of priest or something like that. And he goes, and through a series of questions and answer and dialogue, he reduces Euthyphro to tears, because Euthyphro in the end realizes I haven't the slightest idea what piety is. I don't know anymore. Get me away from this monster. So that's when Plato wants to make a rational point. He wants to employ his critical mind. He does it in that way. But the other side was when he tells a story, right? So the myth of Atlantis, you have the myth of the cave. If you know the myth of the cave, human beings are chained in a cave, and they can only see what's in front of them, and behind them there's a kind of fire, and then there's people carrying sort of statues, and the shadows from the fire get cast on the wall. And the philosopher is the one who can somehow turn around and actually see what's happening, and then get out of the cave. And the sunlight is so bright, it dazzles him. And he goes back in the cave and he tries to tell the others, and they, what are you talking about? Well, there's reality right there in front of us like that. So that's a myth. That's a myth. There's many other myths. So when he wants to make a positive point, he tells a story. So Plato too is in both, and he's one of the readable philosophers. It's dialogue. It's like a play. But the next guy, Plato's student, Aristotle, he gets rid of all the myth. And this is the beginning of it being sort of purely kind of rational inquiry. And he's sort of the first research scientist because his pupil, Alexander the Great, for all the horrible things he did and the conquering he did, he spread, it was through his conquest that Greek culture spread. But Alexander sent back all these specimens and different stuff from all the different lands he went to Aristotle. And Aristotle had this collection of sort of research material. But this becomes this tradition of it's rational inquiry, no more myth, no more story. And this is a famous painting by Raphael, where you have Plato on one side, and he has his hand going up, to the stars, because Plato's basic idea is that the earth, the world we live in now, is much like the myth of the cave and the shadows. This is sort of a copy of the higher world, the ideals. So in a simple sense, we all know what a chair is. That's because in the world of forms, in the higher ideal world, there's the ideal chair that all chairs participate in some way. We don't see that. That's not sensible. We can't see that chair. We only see the many chairs around us. But we can know that. We can raise our mind to that level and understand. This is a kind of pale copy of this higher realm, the realm of the forms. So that's why Plato's pointing up, but Aristotle's pointing down. He's saying, no, it's here. It's the earth here now. We have to pay attention to what's on the here and now. And that more or less becomes the Western tradition, a way of knowing. So at this point, the mythological way of knowing, the poetic way of knowing, the imaginal way of knowing has kind of lost its pride of place. And if we jump, several centuries ahead, what we get is the rise and the dominance of just one way of knowing. This is this way of rational inquiry. And we can say where we find ourselves now in the cosmos, it kind of starts with Copernicus, who's the one who Copernicus, all these books, science, history, it's like they talk about these guys as being these fantastic heroes and all this kind of stuff. He didn't even want to publish the book that explains, how the planets go around the sun. It was only at the very end, at his deathbed, that he agreed to do it and all that. He was a very finicky, kind of neurotic kind of character, Copernicus, but that's the beginning. So no more harmony of the spheres, right? It's not Earth at the bottom or Earth at the center of this nested concentric circles that, beautifully move around us and create this kind of hum that the philosopher can hear. Oh no, the sun's at the center and the planets go around the sun. And suddenly everything is different. The whole way people understood the world was completely different. It took a while. I mean, it's just first the intellectual elite that know about this, and gradually there's all the resistance of the church and all that. But then you get Galileo. All these men are geniuses and they made remarkable contributions. But in this particular story I'm trying to tell here, Galileo, he's the one who separates what he calls primary qualities from secondary qualities. Secondary qualities are everything that we like about the world: color, smells, tastes, all sensation, everything that we see a blue sky or a beautiful, sunset. That's just happening here. That's just subjective. What's really out there, when I look at a sunset and feel awe, it's like, well, there's just different, it's just refraction of electromagnetic waves through the atmosphere. And my eyes and your eyes just happen to pick up one frequency as red and another frequency as whatever color. But really out there in the sense that if we weren't there seeing it, there wouldn't be any color. There wouldn't be anything like that. It would just be, these electromagnetic waves and stuff. So you get that. Then you have Kepler, the laws of planetary motion, Descartes trying to find that one nugget of certainty, the one nugget of certainty from which he could build this new body of knowledge. And it's the fact that he said, well, I can imagine a demon tricking me into everything I see around me. So if I put a pot on the boil and it boils, he's just making me see it boil. Maybe it doesn't boil at all. Maybe it's really freezing. How do I know? How do I know I'm not dreaming? Is basically, Descartes' thing. How do I know that anything around me is not a dream? What can I base the beginning of any kind of certainty on? And famously, it was cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Which I have to say, I don't think Descartes meant the cause of my arising is my thinking. I think he meant the one indubitable thing that I can't doubt is the fact that I think, that I exist, because even if a demon tricked me out of everything, I had to exist in order for him to trick me, right? He can't trick me if I don't exist. So the one nugget of he found was that his own mind, my cogito, and that's the beginning of the mind-body separation that we're still lumbering under. Philosophers are still trying to figure out, how did the mind and the body come together? Well, it must be all mind. No, it must be all body. Well, it isn't. It's the two of them, but we don't have the conceptual apparatus or the language in order to, first of all, go back and understand the mistake Descartes made, and then to, although many people have tried, and then, and then to go a different route. And then, Newton is the one who brings it all together, enabling us to, shoot rockets out into space. But you might not know, Newton himself, I mean, he considered discovering gravity and all of the sort of mathematical sort of stuff that he did kind of like side work. His main thing was that he was an alchemist. He was in search of the philosopher's stone, and he was very keen on biblical chronology. He was trying to predict when the end of the world, and he said it the early 21st century. So he was right about gravity. So I don't know. So, but this is the beginning of this dominance of this whole other way of knowing things, which is not the imaginative way of knowing. But was something lost along the way? Yes, there was. And someone who noticed that what was lost was someone who was just as logical, just as mathematical, just as scientific as these fellows. But it was a fellow named Blaise Pascal, who was a logician. When he was a young boy, he sat in on math classes with Descartes, and they were friends. He used to swap, algorithms or stuff like that. But he was also a theologian or a kind of religious philosopher. One of the things he did, he invented one of the earliest computers. It's called the Pascaline. And he was put it together for his father. His father was a tax collector. So he's helping his father, do his sums and that sort of thing. But along with doing that, he was, in a way, you could say he was an early existentialist, because he was one of the first ones to recognize like what it really meant, realize, as I said earlier, what it really meant that this new Copernican world is like. And in a collection of notes that were left after his death, that they published as his penses, he has one where he says, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. So he's one of the first ones peering up into the sky. And again, it's not electrified. So when they looked up at the night sky back then, they saw all the stars. I live in London. I see barely a handful, on a good night here. So he's in the midst of that, that sense of awe and all that. So he's aware of these existential worries about what's happening, we left the cozy world and we're into this world now where we don't really know what's going on. It's very big and it's very dark. But he also wrote about something that he called the spirits of geometry and the spirits of finesse. And I've talked about geometry already. The thing about geometry is that, or anything like that, is that it's a way of knowing that deals with things that have a clear definition. Nobody argues of like the definition of a right angle or the hypotenuse or whatever it is, anything like that. It's there. And you can walk somebody through doing a quadratic equation. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and there. And if you do it right, it'll always turn out that way. And it'll turn out whether you're doing it in Minnesota, whether you're doing it in Shanghai, whether you're doing it on the moon. It'll always be like that. That's how it is. But the spirit of finesse, and living here in London, although I'm not interested in footy, when I looked up finesse on Google Images, that's what came up. Guys playing soccer for the States with footy. It's something that, it's a way of knowing, but it isn't, you can't teach finesse to somebody. They can learn it from you watching you maybe, but you can't say you do this, then you do that, and then you do that. No, it's just something that you do. It's a way of knowing that the philosopher Michael Polanyi called tacit knowing or implicit knowing. It's a knowing more than you can say, right? So think about how when you ride a bike, you learn how to ride a bike, right? You didn't say, okay, I have to turn handlebar that many, step on the pedal that many degrees and do this. No, you just got on, you fell off, you got on, you fell off. And one day, oh, you could do it. And before you could do that, you had to spend all of your attention, your consciousness on those specific, actions. Or the same thing if you're typing or learning how to play a musical instrument. It's when I first learned how to play guitar, it was a pain in the ass because I had to like make sure my hand was in the right place at the same time and all that kind of thing. And then one day, wow, you could do it. And it takes over. That's knowing in this tacit way. You've passed over what you had to focus your concentration on to another part of yourself that does it kind of automatic. It knows it implicitly. Now, the virtue in that is that now you could think about, oh, what do I want to type? Where do I want to ride the bike? What do I want to play in the guitar? So it allows you to do meta level thinking about the thing. You don't have to think every time you go type something, you have to remember where the keys are. So this is, but the problem with that is, like I said, with the other way of knowing, you can lead somebody else through it, but you can't do this with this imaginative way of knowing. And this was something that someone many, many years later than Pascal, and there was many people along the way in between the two, realized. And this is the German writer Ernst Jünger, who was also an entomologist. I haven't made this point, but a lot of people I'm talking about, they had their foot in the imaginative realm, but they were also in some form of the scientific kind of well. So you could say they had their foot in gnosis and a foot in episteme. And people in the psychedelic world might remember that Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, wrote about accounts he and Jünger tripped in the 50s in Germany, in 60s like that. And Jünger, remarkable German mind. He's not that well known in the English speaking world, but a book he wrote called The Adventurous Heart was a book that inspired Hoffman. And he was a fan, and he wrote to him about it. But in that book, The Adventurous Heart, Jünger talks about what he calls the circumference, the center, and the master key. And this is, he said, when we know something, there's two ways we can approach it. You can approach it from the circumference, from the outside. And for that, you need ant-like industry. This is the step one, step two, step three, slowly, slowly, slowly getting to the heart of the thing, right? And so it's a slogging kind of way of doing it. But it's sure, but you'll get there eventually, but it takes a lot of time. But he says there's another way where we can now stop directly bullseye, directly to the midpoint. This is this kind of immediate kind of way of knowing. And it's, he uses the metaphor, it's like having the master key to all the rooms in a hotel, right? Each of the specialists in their particular, air patch or niche of knowledge these days, and my God, the niches are increasing exponentially. Everybody's a specialist. It's something these days. They have the key to their room, right? And they doggedly protect their room, and they don't want anybody else getting in there because that's their patch and all that. But if you have the master key, you can get into any room. But again, you can't explain to them how you did it. You can't explain, you can't say, I did this, I did that, and then it just came to you. The knowledge came to you. It comes all at once. The industrious way of approaching it, it's one thing at a time, bit by bit. But this other way, it comes all at once. And we all experience things like that. I mean, we experience it in, you get the meaning of a joke, you get the meaning of a poem or something like that, or a dream, something. So it hits you, the aha moment, sort of thing. So, I mean, it's something that, it's not necessarily mystical, it's something that we experience already. And although in some other cases, there are very, very extreme cases of this, the idiot savants, who can't tie their shoes or brush their teeth, but they can tell you whether a 20-digit number is a prime or not. A prime is a number that can't be divided by any other number other than itself or one. And there's no rule to figure out whether a large number is a prime. You just have to divide every other number into it. But no, there's cases of brothers who just that's what they did. They entertain each other saying, how about bang that one? No, you can divide it by 16-digit sort of numbers. They just bang off the top of their heads. There's a case of one young boy, late 19th century, who asked his father, exactly, how long ago was he born? And then his father said, so in that case, I've been alive for whatever billions of seconds. And his father said, no, you're wrong. And if whatever they figured out, said, no, you forgot the leap year. So, but that's it. It's nothing else. He didn't go on to be a fantastic mathematician or anything. So it's just a strange way of knowing things that you can't explain, but we jumped the gun and we're able to do it. So here's the living white European male. This is Iain McGilchrist, who you might know from his very important book, The Master and His Emissary. Came out about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more. And what he did was he rebooted the whole left brain, right brain discussion that was sort of taken off the table in the early 90s because neuroscientists didn't like that all the split brain stuff had been associated with pop psychology and new age sorts of things. And then also they had come to the conclusion that actually, even though initially we thought the two sides, did very, very different things, they really do lots of the same things. I mean, one is more, like, the left is more geared to language and the right to image and spatial sorts of things. But more or less, so, and there are cases if, with a stroke where one is, knocked out of commission and the other one starts to pick up, the work that the one that was affected wasn't doing. So, but what McGilchrist said was like, that may be the case, but what the point is not what they do, it's how they do it. It's how they do it. The left brain is dedicated to the step-by-step, one thing at a time, slogging, mathematical, rational way of doing things. That's the surefire thing. And what it does, it reduces everything to that. And it does that for good reason, because it's through that way that we are able to live in the world. We're able to survive in the world. It's what I call survival consciousness. The French philosopher Henri Bergson in the early 20th century, he said the brain serves an eliminative function. And it's the organ dedicated to dealing with life in the sense that it cuts out 90% of the reality around us and only gives us a small bit, just what we need in order to deal with things, to get by, right? So the left brain reduces everything to something it knows already. It classifies everything. And McGilchrist said is that actually the left brain was brought into being by the right brain, which is earlier, and it just presences things. It gives the immediate now-ness of thing, what I call the isness, or the Meister Eckhart, the mystic, called Istigkeit. This is German for isness. It's so you could say the left brain takes care of business, and the right brain takes care of isness. And it's funny that I did it that way because the right hand is controlled by the left brain, and the left hand is controlled by the right brain. So there's it splits over some way. And the difference, he said, is that the right brain has this kind of laser-like accuracy, pinpoint accuracy. So it looks at the forest, then it sees the tree, then it sees the branch, then it sees the leaf, then it sees the cells, then it sees the mushrooms, then it sees, and closer and closer and closer, fine tuning to absolute accuracy of stuff, but it does that at the expense of losing the context. Because the right brain gives you everything at once, and it's there and it's indubitable. When we have these moments when you see a leaf for the first time or something like that, the left for a moment has gone off duty, and you're just seeing the leaf, and it's that leaf. It's not abstract leaf, which is what we usually do. Oh, tree, car, person, just to get by. We can't deal with everything in its own immediate uniqueness. we'd be stopped on our tracks. You know, we develop these kinds of symbols, way to deal with, just to deal with the world. But every now and then, oh, you see the leaf, you see the sunset, you see the cloud, or the person, and they're not. You're not seeing them utilitarianly. You're not seeing them. What do I have to do? How do I deal with them? You're just seeing them. And this is what the right brain does. And interestingly enough, about 100 years earlier than McGilchrist's book, there was a classicist at Cambridge, and he wrote a book called From Religion to Philosophy, is F.M. Cornford. And it's precisely about that shift earlier I talked about, from the mythological age to the mental age, the thinking age, the axial time. And he said, yes, that happened, but actually it wasn't quite the immediate, cut off from one to the other, as I've tried to show as well. The rational thinking, the theoretical man emerged from this past mythological background. But he said the danger has been that even then, he was saying 100 years ago, and even earlier, people like Blake were saying it in the previous century, that it's become dominant. It's become dominant because it's effective, it's practical, it's utilitarian, it works. It works by cutting everything else out, but it works. And he said that there are these two permanent needs of human nature, two modes of the two traditions, and he calls the vague and the precise. Now, we immediately say, like, well, we don't want to be vague. We want everything to be simple, clear, and direct. Yes, there's tremendous profit in that, and it's virtuous. But sometimes if things are too clear, too bright, they obscure other things. The sun obscures the stars. Stars don't go away. They're out there, but you can't see them. Not because of the smog, you can't see them because of the sun. So something very bright, immediate, daylight consciousness blocks out all this other stuff. What McGilchrist has said is that what's happened is that the left has become increasingly dominant. And because in order to deal with the world, the best way you can deal with the world is to turn into something it knows already. So the right, when the right brain just looks out on the world, what it's seeing these days is a world that's completely created by the left. There's very little unless you go out with nature. And even that is kind of like you have to go and you have to, book your time there in advance, and it's all, slotted into this, best time to do it and all that kind of thing. The right brain sees less and less of just the immediate world, the natural world. It only sees the left. And so in a way, it becomes increasingly inhibited, but there's nothing for it to do. There's nothing left for it to. So, and this is what's happening. This is one of the contributing things to what I said earlier, but Gebser talking about the breakdown of the mental rational consciousness structure. It's starting to take itself apart because there's nothing left for it to do. So what happens when you get this dominance of the left brain is you get scientism. This is the great American historian Jacques Barzun, who died, I'm trying exactly when, but he lived in the early 2000s, but he lived to be about 107. So he was born very early 20th century, and he lived into very early 21st century. And if you ever get a chance, is one of the last things he wrote is this huge doorstopper book called From Dawn to Decadence. And it's a history of the West from the Renaissance up to like rap, gangster rap or something like that. He talks about in the very end. So it's sort of like all the virtues, the good. See, the problem today, it's not good versus ego. It's competing goods. Competing goods. My personal freedom, which is a good. My obligation to society, which is a good. So those two. It's always that's what politics is about. It's all about, equating those, finding a balance between those two things. But now they clash completely all the time. It's not even in the sense that it's difficult to bring them together. They sort of don't even get anywhere close together. And so a variety of other things too, you want to respect other cultures, tolerance, but you're against female, genital mutilation. Well, that's part of the culture. Oh no, it's horrible, So which is the good there? Respecting the other culture, or imposing your Western ideas about human rights and so on and so on. So I mean, that's just top of my head. I have nothing intelligent to say about any of that sort of stuff. I'm just using it as, simple kind of contrast between things. So you have scientism is the belief that the scientific method can answer everything. It's the only way to answer anything. There is no other way to answer anything. But that is not science itself. Scientism is a belief. It's the new religion. It's not science. Science is study of nature and behavior of things and knowledge obtained to them, pursuit and application of knowledge, understanding natural phenomena. Science is the view that only science can render truth about the world and reality. Those are very different. And we've seen people already who, scientists, but also inhabited the imaginative world. So it doesn't have to be like that. It's just become very dominant. It's become dominant because it's effective. In the 1950s, there was a famous book called The Two Cultures by a fellow named C.P. Snow. Was a novelist, but he himself was a scientist too, so somebody else. And he argued that this is the beginning of when science was becoming very, very popular. So the 50s, sci-fi movies, the mad scientist, the whole idea, better life through chemicals and all this kind of stuff. And all the pipe smoking corduroy jacket, with the patch on the elbows, humanists, the poets, and all that, they were getting left behind. And they were all arguing like, well, we don't like science. It's all too logical and that kind of stuff. And Snow was saying, well, look, you just got to get your skates on and get up to speed with us, because this is the way things are. But Barson said it's not two cultures. As we said, there are people, we've shown people already who occupied these two spheres. There's one mind, but it works in two different modes. It works in two different ways. And Barson said there's no reason why you can't have someone who could, be like Euclid and also like Walt Whitman, a poet, but also, mathematician. And over here, we have somebody who's like that, the German poet Goethe. We know for Faust. Faust is one of the first works in Western literature to recognize this problem. Faust has sought all knowledge, and he's still not happy. That's why he winds up making a deal with the devil. Because I've had knowledge, I've studied this, I've studied philosophy, I've studied science, and I'm not happier than I am now. And Goethe also wrote two souls, dwell within my breast. Well, he got his anatomy wrong because it's up here. The two souls dwell up there, and they don't get along. And he spells that out. But Goethe himself was a poet, playwright, novelist, great lover, but he also was a statesman and a scientist. He wrote about the metamorphosis of plants. He was an early evolutionist. He actually discovered, it's called the maxillary bone. It's a tiny, tiny bone in the human jaw that was known to exist in animals, prior to us and the notion of evolutionary progress. But human beings didn't seem to have it. And this was an argument that we're a special creation, we're a special dispensation by God. And Goethe said, no, we're not, we're part of nature. Although he wasn't Darwinian, it wasn't blind mechanical chance. There was a living force, there was a living spirit, a living soul within nature that was emerging and growing and expressing itself. And we're a part of that. We're the cutting edge, as it were, said earlier. But he discovered the bone. So he's a scientist, but he's a poet as well. So it's not impossible. You can have the two things work. And what I call when the two things work together, I call it the Goldilocks effect. So if you know the old, fairy tale about Goldilocks, and she goes to the house of three bears, and this porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold. Oh, this porridge is just right. Or this bed is too hard, this bed is too soft, this bed is just right. I think there's some deep esoteric significance in the Goldilocks fairy tale, because it's all about threes, because nothing really happens. She sneaks into the place, she has the porridge, she sleeps in the bed, the bears come home, she jumps out the window. So, but there's something in there, some law of three or something like that. But it's that not left or right, but just right. It's just right when you have the two of them working together. And this was something the esoteric tradition is known from day one. They talked about that, say, in the Axial age, the Tao and the Yin Yang, and they each have a little bit of the other. And that's like, the left brain dealing with the right side of the body and the right brain dealing with the left side of the body. So if it was one brain, that you might fight each other. And this actually happens with people who've had there's something called the corpus callosum. It's like a knot of fibers that connects the two sides of the brain. And during an epileptic fit, there's like an electrical storm that goes back and forth across the hemispheres. And one way to stop that was to cut this thing. So the electrical charges wouldn't have a way to get over to the other side of the brain. And this seemed to work. But one of the side effects of this they discovered is that people would they'd get in a position where someone would be getting something at the supermarket and the other hand would say no, or somebody would like be taking some clothes out of the closet and they'd no, we don't want that. We literally are two people. I mean, the one we identify with is the one who speaks this language, I. But there's an ally, a neighbor, a couple millimeters away from us, doesn't use language, speaks in images, hunches. You know that phenomena when you have a name on the tip of your tongue? You know it. The right brain knows it, but it doesn't speak. And it's trying to get it over to you. And it's like, I know you don't know it, or you did know it, you forgot it, but your friend over here knows it. He's trying to get it across to you. And it's the nudging. I mean, may have been what Socrates called the daemon. Ashanti was talking about, when you do the right thing, you know it. And you're doing the wrong thing, you feel, icky or whatever. And it could be this other, and we all know the old, the angel and the devil on the other side, and when talking all that kind of stuff like that. Maybe it could very well be that's all of that kind of stuff comes out of this confrontation or the conflict between the two sides. So in the end, can lost knowledge, imagination be regained? Is it truly lost? What if it weren't? Imagine that. And I just have these figures here because there's some of the people I talk about in the book. This is the poet Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. If you remember Kubla Khan, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree. And he also wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Well, he wrote about the imagination. And he said there's what he calls true imagination, and then what he calls fancy or fantasy. And he said what fancy or fantasy does, it takes what's already available and puts it together in strange combination. So a flying pig or a unicorn. Or the surrealist said, the unlikely appearance of an umbrella on an operating table. So it's an initial shock in some kind of way, but it's not, for Coleridge, it wasn't truly creative because it doesn't go down deep into the true origins of the imagination and create something that's in a way new, but not novel. Not novel. It's new in the sense that it renews and brings back up from the depths the knowledge of the imagination. This is a fellow named Owen Barfield, who wrote a book about Coleridge. He was also one of the Inklings. This was a group in Oxford in the early 20th century that included C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And they used to meet at a pub in Oxford and talk about poetry and mythology. And so he was in on Tolkien talking about Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis talking about, Narnia and stuff like that. He did write some fiction early on, but didn't carry on. But he wrote a lot about the history of language. He wrote a fascinating book called History in English Words. And he said, if you trace language further and further back, an odd thing is that the further back you go, the more poetic it becomes, the more imaginative. And this seemed to go against all standard notions of how evolution Darwinian worked. Something really simple first, then it gradually gets more complex. So at the time he wrote this book, 1920s, the standard idea was, there was called the ug-ug theory there's the ug-ug theory and the woo-woo theory of language, where you pointed something, ug-ug, and two ugs was the tree, four ugs was something else, you know what I mean? And then gradually that became, but how do they know what does it mean to point at something? You know what I mean? Like you sort of have to know that someone's doing that means you have to look at it in the first place. So we do that automatically. You have to imagine a time when There was no communication whatsoever. And you have to think language, it couldn't have been just one person who got it and taught everybody else. It had to be something that was communal, something that emerged, in a group at the same time. But he said, actually, what it was that the reason that the ancient languages had this kind of imaginative character, and it was the same sort of thing that he experienced in reading poetry, it was the metaphors in it, was that they actually saw the world that way. They saw the world in that mythological way that I talked about in the beginning of the talk. They saw the world in this way that it was embodied with gods and spirits and forces in some way. We see it now as prose, completely factual. It's stuff. This has no insides. Barfield said back in the day, we were able to somehow perceive nature's inside. The only inside now is ours. So it's in this gradual evolution of consciousness that he talked about. It's been withdrawn from the world and it inhabits us now. And this is like an intermediary stage for another stage where we will regain this participation, but have it consciously. Our ancient ancestors were embedded in it. They didn't know. They didn't feel the separation from the world that we feel. They were in the world like figures on a tapestry. We're in the world like something, like we're in a box. We're all in a container. That's how we see the world. They saw themselves as somehow the world was like a tapestry. And one of the things you can chart the shift from that way of seeing is what Gebser talks about, the rise of perspective in painting. Because until the rise of perspective, everything's flat. And suddenly you get distance. And things in earlier paintings, the size of things depended on their importance, and generally their religious importance. Right, so you might have a picture of a saint. It might be a mountain, and the mountain's really small, but the saint is big, or just something like that, because the saint is the most important thing. But the rise of perspective is like, no, it's natural. It's a natural world. So again, it's another shift away from the mythological world into this world of perspective. So somebody else that's in it is Jung. Jung, when he went through the breakup with Freud, and depending on your point of view, he had a psychotic episode, or the night sea journey into his unconscious that he recorded in the Red Book. But he had these experiences. Well, we were talking earlier about entities, before the main event got going, and Jung believed that he in these what he called active imagination, where he would allow kind of dreams and fantasies to rise up, but try to retain his consciousness at the same time, not completely go into the dream, but then you lose your critical sense, and you're completely taken over by the dream. But to allow it happen and stay with it, and then he would get into a dialogue with these figures. And Salome, was one. Philemon. If you know the image, he's like he's a gentleman, bald and white beard. He looks like Freud a bit, and he's got these wings sticking out, and he's like a kingfisher, which is this sort of bird and all that. So Jung would have these conversations with these figures, and he said, I came to see that there was what he called the objective psyche, which I think is a more useful term than the collective unconscious, because it avoids the notion of kind of one mind sort of things. It meant there are things in the psyche that have nothing to do with me. I share that space with them. This is what Philemon said. You think what you're experiencing here is all you, but this is like a forest. You go into the forest and there's trees and there's flowers and there's animals. They don't belong to you. You're sharing that space with them. So, I mean, this is what crazy people would say, and this was, Jung, one reason why he didn't talk very openly about these experiences for quite some time, because he was talking to people in his head. And that's what people came to see him for. People, doctor, I'm talking figures in my head. He was doing that. But this is the encounter that he had. So he got knowledge of the imagination through the imagination, even entered this completely other imaginal world. And I'll just end with this fellow here, Henri Corbin, who started out as a phenomenologist, branch of philosophy. Then he became a scholar of Persian mysticism. And he coined the term the imaginal, which is different than the imaginary. So the imaginal would be the realm in which Jung was having his conversations with these figures in his head. And it's a world that has its own ontology. It has its own kind of structure and geography. It has its own inhabitants. But it requires the precision instrument of a trained imagination. And he talks about the Persian mystic Shuwaradi in the 10th century, who went on these journeys to Mount Kaf and these inner kind of travelogues. And Shuwaradi was a student of Neoplatonism and the Hermetic tradition and all that. It had left Alexandria and was living in the Arabic world at the time. So it's another case in which it's like knowledge of the imagination, but also complete participation in this other realm that's there, metaphorically. You know, if I broke it up my head, you know, like Daniel did with his first book, he broke up in his head. I said in my review of the book, he had broken open his head so many times you would think he would have installed hinges. But you know, if I go into my head, I'm not going to see any of this sorts of stuff. It happens in some realm that it's not physical, it's not sensory, although within it, we can experience physical. We feel like we're touching something. We might feel like we're tasting. We certainly see things in the dream, but we don't, or that imaginal space, but we don't see them with our senses. So I think I've talked quite a bit here. So thank you very much for enduring this. And I hope we got something out of it. Thank you.
You're such an incredible wealth of info.
Thank you.
What are you working on now, actually?
Well, let's see, two things. One thing that's with my published one, Inner Traditions, is a memoir I wrote. I wrote it last year, just to keep myself occupied. So it's basically, it starts, you know, I'm often asked, how did I go from playing in rock bands to, you know, doing the stuff I do now? So I wrote a book to answer that question. But strangely enough, or oddly enough, the most recent thing I've just got commissioned from another publisher to had an idea for a book. I mentioned isness or istigkeit in the talk, in a book about that. And that comes out of an experience I had a few years back here when they had the first lockdown, you know, from COVID. And actually, I know it was a horrible time, but I have to say, I very selfishly have sort of first lockdown nostalgia, because it was, you know, the air was clean, you could hear the birds, there's no traffic, you know, it was so. But one day, one morning, I have a garden here and the back door opens out to the garden. I went out, had a cup of coffee in hand, and I suddenly said, "What's that?" And it was the sun. And I was surprised by the sun. And for a couple seconds, I couldn't place it. It was, what the? And then everything kicked in. Yeah, it's the sun, blah, 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 blah. But it was, and I tried to figure out, I think the reason that happened, or the antecedent sort of actions that led to it, was that because there was the lockdown, I changed my schedule. I changed my routine quite a bit. And, you know, you really had to stay indoors. And so in order to just get some kind of exercise, to do something different, instead of going to the usual markets I would go to, and they didn't have anything anyway. You know, the shelves were all kind of, you know, stripped. The only thing left one day when I went to the local market was all the matzah crackers. So you know, but it was, we'll get to that. We'll survive on matzahs. But no, I was going to all these other little markets around, and I was kind of in sort of crisis mode. Not exactly, but sort of, I was putting a little bit more into everything I did, just a little bit more effort, a little bit, just tiny little bit of stuff and attention. And you know, I'm very keen on the British writer Colin Wilson, and I've written a book about him. And he has this concept called the robot, and it's very simple. It's kind of an automatic pilot we have that it takes over repetitious duties, so we don't have to, you know, deal with them ourselves. So it's the robot that finally learns how to speak French. It's the robot that finally knows how to type. It's the robot that finally knows how to ride your bike and stuff like that. Absolutely indispensable. We couldn't get by without him. But like the left brain, he does his job too well. He's too zealous, and he starts doing things that you'd rather do yourself. I mean, I was a kid on TV, there was no commercial. I think it was for Excedrin or Anacin, where a mother is trying to do everything for the daughter, and the daughter turns around, "Mother, I really want to do it myself." And that's what we want to do with the robot. And the robot's not a villain. He's basically, "Oh, sit back, baby. I'll chill. I'll take care of everything." But what happens is he starts living and we're not living. So he's listening to the music. He sees the sunset, or she. He's eating the food. He's making love to your partner or whatever. And you realize you're not living. And there's a line from T.S. Eliot, one of his poems, he says, "Where is the life we have lost in living?" And Wilson said it's in the hands of the robot. But Wilson discovered that where something pleasant won't get you out of it, but an inconvenience, some kind of obstacle, a crisis, will somehow jar you out of it. And momentarily you are in control. And Gurdjieff, the enigmatic esoteric teacher, he was a master of creating inconvenience. He was a master of creating artificial crisis. He was a master of pushing people to the extremes. Sometimes it was brutal and it wasn't for everybody, but he would push them to extremes, and that's when they would wake up. There's this story about, he had this, his prairie, his Institute for Harmonious Development of Man, which is outside Paris in Fontainebleau. And there's a story where A.R. Orage, who was a very famous literary editor in London at the time, again 100 years ago, he became very interested in Gurdjieff's work, and he wanted to go. He wanted to go to the Institute. So he went there, and as soon as he got there, he was forbidden to smoke. He was like a 2-pack a day guy, and he was given a shovel, and he was told to dig. So he dug a big hole, and they said, "Okay, fill it in." And he did that the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And suddenly, like after a week or two, he's like, "What the hell have I got myself into?" And the nicotine withdrawal is starting to kick in as well. And so he was crying himself to sleep. And then he kept saying, "I can't do it. I can't. Okay, I'll make myself one more." He goes one more day and starts doing it. And suddenly he's enjoying the digging. And he's digging like he never dug before. And he's just like throwing it. And he just suddenly felt this influx of energy. And William James, famously said, "We live subject to degrees of fatigue which we come only by habit to obey." And so what Gurdjieff did was he induced second wind. If athletes, "I can't make it anymore. Okay, one more and bang, you on an extra tank of gas." He was able to do that. He was able to somehow create these situations and that happened. So in a mild sort of way, I think that's what happened when I walked out the door on that morning and I looked up and I was surprised by the sun. So that was kind of, so what happened then? What happened then? So that was sort of the idea behind the book. So I haven't started writing it yet. So they just agreed to do it. So my title is "Taking Care of Isness," but they don't like that title, which I think is a good title. I'm trying to say, if I saw that on the book on the stand, I'd pick that up. I say, "Oh, nobody knows what isness is." Well, that's the whole idea. But I'm going to write it. You know how it is. The title, everything wraps around the title. So I'm going to write it with that in my mind as the title anyway. And I think they'll see at the end that it's a good title. Don't tell them. I hope they don't watch this.
You can call it "The Business of Isness."
Well, that's in there as that comes in.
So I want to have a little time for people to ask questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. Sure.
I guess, kind of from all of your studies in this area, which is also applicable to the course thesis in a way, like what is your kind of like perspective now? I mean, do you think that we are ever going to recapture the lost knowledge of the imagination? Are we going through just a Kali Yuga-esque, Rene Guénon-esque decline and degeneration? Or do you think that Steiner, Gurdjieff, these guys are pointing towards something that we're going to maybe access as a way?
I think it's something that it's potentially available to us, but we have to do the work. It's not something that's going to happen automatically. I mean, even Gebser said, Gebser said you participate with these things consciously, right? And if you do that, the transition can be less chaotic.
Yeah,
he said it's not going to be a picnic in any way, but it can be less chaotic. But if you don't participate, it'll certainly be absolutely chaotic and catastrophic and all that. So
I mean, when Gurdjieff sort of saw his mission in a way as a failure in the end, right? He felt that he tried to, it's like almost he was given this task to, create an initiatory process for the sort of deviant modern Western psyche. And maybe in the end, he felt that he wasn't really able to accomplish that and sort of,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, well, there's a sense that in his last days there was a sadness around him,
yeah.
and I think perhaps maybe he felt that he hadn't. Well, you only get the material that comes to you. I think that's one of the things too when you set yourself up as a guru. You only get what comes to you. So, I mean, if you write your books, you don't have that immediate, the exchange between you and the student and all that. But you write your books, and anybody can get them. Whereas like when you actually have people, you only deal with who comes to you. And I mean, not to denigrate, he had like a handful of people like Uspensky and J.G. Bennett and Orage and the ones like the early first generation who kind of, they knew what was going on about it. And they all went in different directions. I mean, but I think Gurdjieff, he had a great sense of sorrow, a great sense of like the pain and suffering of the world. And I think he knew what was wrong with human beings, but he seemed to have less of a grasp on what, the good. Ashanti was saying we're not all evil. Yeah, we're not all evil. That's the thing I was going to say. I don't think we're born evil. I think we're born stupid and lazy. And then gradually, with any luck, we we work and develop some kind of discipline, in order to make something out of ourselves. So I mean, Rousseau's wrong when he said, we're all born free, but we live in chains or something like that. No, we're not born free at all. We're born with so many restrictions and limitations on us. But free will is possible. Consciousness is possible, but it takes effort. And I think that's the whole thing, effort too. My argument for free will is effort. No machine can make an effort.
Right, but that's very good.
Machine,
Yeah, that's very
no
good.
machine can try harder.
Yeah, but Gary, that's very Gurdjieffian, right? He talked about how a soul is not something we simply are given.
Yeah.
We have to work through conscious labor and intentional suffering
Yeah.
to.
Well, I mean, but he also at sometimes there's a story where J.G. Bennett um, was somehow concerned about his mother who just passed away, and he asked Gurdjieff for some help, and he gave him this meditative practice in order to imagine his mother and imagine Gurdjieff's mother, who was already dead, and getting the two together. But J.G. Bennett's mother didn't work to create the soul. So Gurdjieff, some ways he bent that and he accepted that there was some kind of,
Yeah.
immortality. So, but again, that's the carrot or the stick. I mean, the whole idea is the effort, and the effort is one thing where you can feel alive. You can that's what I'm saying. No machine can make an effort. No machine can decide to try harder. I can decide to try harder, and with second wind, I can suddenly find energy that I didn't even know I had. So, I'm I forget that recently there was a big book. It was in the news that some philosopher proved that there was no free will or something like that. The whole idea of doing that to me just like what an absurd waste of time. But in any case, I'm going on.
Question. So let's say somebody was like, okay, Gary, love your books, love your ideas, reading all your books. Here's like, I want you to put your ideas into practice and create like an institution, a school. I want you to like train people so they can have this like mutational break or access the active imagination or move into the next octave of consciousness or whatever. And here's like,
I'm not a guru. I'm not a guru though. I'm not a
but
guru.
you don't have to be a guru. What would you do? What would you have?
I mean, I just said it. I mean, look, the next time you have to clean your flat, or the next time there's something you really hate doing, love doing it. Put everything you got into doing it. Remember Orage digging and crying himself to sleep, thinking, what the hell have I got? I used to tell H.G. Wells he didn't know what he was talking about. And here I am digging a ditch with this nutty guy from Armenia. What am I doing? And then the next day, he's discovered that he's a millionaire. So put more in the robot. The robot does everything for us most of the time. Do something. Don't let the robot do it. And again, the robot's not a bad guy. or a bad girl. We need them. If you don't have the robot, you can't tie your shoes.
And that was
But
interesting. Also, the process of as one gets older, I think the robot tends to take over more and more, right? People just go into this very automatic.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. You know, we have to fight against that too. I mean, but we talked earlier this idea that evolution of consciousness is colonial. And I would say it is, but not in this political sense. I would say it's spirit trying to colonize matter. It's the force of life coming into this world of what we call matter here, and gaining a greater foothold on it and increasing freedom. That's what Bergson said. So a rock doesn't have any freedom at all, you know, but a plant has a little bit more freedom. It can take advantage of its, you know, surroundings in some way and it absorbs stuff from it and it can grow. An animal has even more freedom. It doesn't have to stay in one space. It can go move around in different spaces to do things. Human beings have even more freedom because we not only inhabit the physical world, and we inhabit an inner world that more or less we think animals don't have, although I'm not against panpsychism at all, but a rock doesn't have, like Bergson said, the unconsciousness of a falling rock is different from the unconsciousness of a growing cabbage. So there might be some kind of pan consciousness over it, but it's not, you know, the tree isn't thinking, what am I going to do today? You know, but not only do we inhabit this physical world, this inner, we also inhabit this world of ideas, this world of culture, which is something that didn't come into the world until we existed. It did not come into the world until we were here and we started building this. You know, it's what it's the noosphere in some way, or what Karl Popper called World 3. You know, the first world is the physical world, the second world is sort of the internal world. World 3 is the world of ideas. So if there was a catastrophe, you know, and all the libraries were destroyed, it would take an immense amount of time for us to rebuild anything. But the libraries weren't destroyed, and there was still, we had access to that. We could, I don't think I'm not a dystopian. I don't think we necessarily are really going to go, you know, smack into a wall, but I think things are going to get an even bit more dicey than they have been now.
Gary, question for you. When you brought up before about the laws that were subjected to, it also reminded me of Gurdjieff. For some reason, doesn't he have this whole thing about how we're at our human stage, we're subject to a certain number of laws, like cosmic law?
Yeah.
120.
Well, that's what he called the ray of creation.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a take on the Neoplatonic ladder of being, or the Kabbalah, or the Hermetic planets. So you have, I mean, the Neoplatonists, this is Plotinus in 200 AD in Alexandria, in Greek Egypt, Roman Egypt by then. And you have, so you have the one, or the absolute, or you have something that's non-manifest. So it's not in the physical world, it's non-manifest. It's the non-manifest source of the physical world. And its energy or its being descends, it comes down. And it necessarily, like the sun necessarily shines. If it did not shine, it would not be a sun. So it doesn't decide to shine, it can't not shine. By definition, it being a sun, it shines. And the shining in the Neoplatonic sense is this more becoming more dense of being. And so you get, then there's the world of forms, the Platonic world of forms, the ideas. And then you get the anima mundi, which is the soul of the world. And it's this kind of inner side of nature, inner side of the world that connects everything to everything else. And then finally, you get the physical kind of world. So, I mean, so Gurdjieff said in his system, the worst place to be is the moon, because the moon is subject to 96 laws. Right. The second worst place is the earth. It's subject to 48 laws. Right. But if you, through the efforts, the teaching, the fourth way, you know, his system, you could raise yourself up to the next level, which would be the level of the sun, and that would be 12 laws. And then there's one more, 6, but nobody ever gets up to that one, that kind of thing. So it's a certain sense, you know, there's certain restrictions on our actions. And you can see the same thing with the Gnostics. There's all the archons, these kind of evil spirits that you have to fight, or the Hermetic journey through the planets. Around the same time as the Gnostics, there were groups called the Hermetists, but we don't know who they are. They were all anonymous. We don't have any names for them. We have some names of the early Gnostics, like Basil, Valentinus, and people like that, but we don't know the Hermetists. But they had this idea that creation, once again, was this descent. And the great Nous hired out. Nous does the mind doesn't do any of the hands-on stuff. He hires out. He gets somebody to do it. So he hires out. He gets the master craftsman, the demiurge. This is in Plato as well, and he's the one who makes the world, right? And he makes the Earth, and he makes all the different planets. And what happened is that man, who originally it's human, man, originally in a spiritual realm with Nous, looked at the handiwork and became so in love with the Earth, so enraptured with the Earth, that it reached out and wanted to embrace it. In doing that, it fell through the planets, the spheres of the planets. And each of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Moon, each of them have certain characteristics, certain kind of qualities that tend to be a bit negative in the sense that they're more and more dense and solidified. So what the Hermetists did, and they went out into the desert in Alexandria, they did these kind of rituals where they tried to evoke or induce what subsequently called cosmic consciousness. G.R.S. Mead was the one who, that got picked up in the 60s with Leary and all that kind of thing. But it was a notion of rising up through the planes, rising up through the different planets, the journey back to the one. So that's a motif that you find through pretty much all of the esotericism, this descent from the one and then the journey back. The Gnostics thought matter was completely evil and there was no redeeming this world at all, whereas Hermetists didn't have quite as pessimistic a view. They said, no, yes, we find ourselves here subject to all these laws and restrictions, but there's ways for us to relieve ourselves of them and regain our true heritage and so on and so on. So yeah, I mean, in a way, I mean, I was involved in the Gurdjieff work many, many years ago in New York and in Los Angeles in the 80s. But in a way, how should we say it? I came to feel it's like scaffolding. There's some things you can see. I'm not saying it's not real, but it's kind of a scaffolding within basically the super effort is the praxis. So it's a context in which you're given a kind of story where it makes sense that you're doing this. So in a way, to get from one level of laws to another, there's a whole system of what Gurdjieff calls kind of hydrogens, and there's different kind of ways in which we can transform energies inside ourselves, and they go from denser to lighter and all this kind of stuff. And it's all put together in a very scientific looking way, because that's who he was pitching the idea to put it as simply as that. So at different times, he presented his system in different ways to different people, because and Ouspensky is the one who, codified all it. And he had a very logical kind of scientific mind. So he's the one who put it together in this kind of nice, neat sort of package. But then Gurdjieff would do something very different. I mean, the last days, about the dinners where he crammed 50 or 60 people into a tiny, tiny, tiny little flat in Paris. And he would make this huge, sumptuous meal. And before it, everybody had to knock back half a dozen shots of vodka. And then he would look at everybody and see them and, pierce their persona, their personality, and see who they really were. And he gave them nicknames and stuff like that. And then they had to eat this sumptuous dinner. And it would go on for hours and hours. So that was very different than, the early stuff.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for Ashanti and Gary for joining us. And yeah, really looking forward to next time. And Gary, I look forward to more opportunities to drill it. I wanted to talk about the Trump and the right wing occultism, but we'll have to save that for another time.
Yeah, we'll do another time. We'll do something else. All right, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to hear Ashanti and also to have my chance to do my bit.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on Wednesday.